Hey everyone. See a lot of people joining really quickly. So, hey, Ernesto and Josh, how's it going?
Hey Josh, nice to meet you, sir.
Josh, you can unmute, man. You're muted.
There you go.
Josh, this is Ernesto, by the way. Ernesto.
Hey Ernesto, how's it going?
Good, nice to meet you, sir.
Yeah, you as well.
You see Ernesto's sweet setup in the background?
I know, right? I'm jealous immediately.
I'm like turning my camera or my laptop a little bit to like not have these light fixtures in the way, and this guy has just got it. That's the setup right there that I aspire to.
Yeah.
So everyone that's piling in, we're gonna wait a couple minutes. We're not even at 2 o'clock yet, and we've already gotten almost 20 people in the door. So this is cool, exciting stuff. And I hope everyone gets a lot out of this. I will remember to hit record.
I was just gonna say.
Yeah, lessons learned, you know, in this COVID world of making this a thing. So yeah, absolutely. Appreciate everyone being here today. Hope everyone had a good Labor Day weekend. Ernesto, how's the temperature out there, man? It was like 110.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I stayed home all day the past 2 days with beautiful air conditioning, but as soon as you stepped out, it's like, holy crap, I'm cooking.
Right. You know, it's like 80 degrees in Asheville, North Carolina right now, and that's about my limit.
Yes.
So when I see the 100 sign, I'm like, I can't do it.
And it's dry. It's dry out here too, so you feel it. You feel it.
Absolutely. For those of you who are entering, I really encourage you to put questions in the chat that I'll be monitoring and we'll be monitoring. If anyone has questions for Josh or myself, that's where we're going to answer those things. So I just wanted to offer that out there. We'll get started in about 5 minutes. Just going to wait for everyone to get in here. Putting my website in the chat. Josh, what is your website?
www.sands.pllc.com.
Okay.
I can type it in there too, I guess, couldn't I?
You could do that.
Make it a little easier for you.
And I'm going to put Ernesto's website in there as well, so you can check his stuff out.
I came in here just to cheerlead, so I didn't know about these extra perks joining in.
Ernesto is the one who made my amazing promotional video out in Estes Park, Colorado, in Rocky Mountain National Park. And that was a really cool experience for any of you therapists out in this world that need a promotional video done. Holy hell, this guy has all his gear. He's ready to go. He's like following me on the trails, and like, it was just unbelievable.
All my cameras, all my gears right there.
All of those cameras, all of that gear.
And this beautiful GoPro right here. I've got 6 of them. I just love them.
Yeah, it was pretty cool for sure.
Which GoPro is that?
This one right here is a 7. I've got the GoPro 8, and I'm gonna geek out. And the GoPro 9 is gonna come out soon too. So.
Oh, cool.
That's the thing, is like, how do you keep up with that and just continuously buy the next one? I just convinced myself to buy a new phone, and it took a lot of effort. Like, I don't need the Google Pixel 2 anymore. I should get the 4. Like,
yeah. When this is your business, many of your toys become tax write-off. So
there you go.
That's a great segue into what we're going to talk about today. Exactly. Is tax write-offs and deductions, and how to make the most out of your expenses in your private practices. So give another couple of minutes, everyone. Get situated, comfortable. And like I said, please feel free to put questions in the chat or comments, anything that you're thinking about in terms of your accounting structure for your private practice. Josh is an accountant here in Asheville, North Carolina. He's actually in the office across the hall from me right now. He's works with a lot of therapists. He's got a lot of therapists as clients, so he really knows that world very well. And I'm happy to answer those questions because I think that can feel like a major barrier when we're starting our private practices, just EIN stuff, LLC versus sole proprietorship. What do I do with my quarterly taxes? How much should I allocate? What can I deduct? Like Ernesto said, like lots of business deductions available. So I just want to encourage y'all to interact if you want to. Really happy to do that. And we'll get going in a minute once Josh gets back in here. All right. So I am going to share my screen and we're going to kind of get going with this. Oh, we've already got a question. Awesome. If I want to make sure I'm legally covered when I begin my private practice, will my liability insurance be enough to cover me if I start as a sole proprietor versus an LLC? Josh and I were just having this conversation because I think that's the most commonly asked question that comes up in all the big social media pages and therapist pages. Cassandra, I appreciate that. Can you speak a bit about PLLCs, S-corps, pros, cons? Also, if you work out of a home office, but contact with other businesses, business address is my home address, okay. Taxing purposes, if we live in one state, see clients in two, do I just pay taxes in home state? Great questions, y'all. And I'm definitely gonna try to monitor these as we get going. Josh is gonna talk for a while, but I'm gonna interrupt him when we have questions that he can answer. Virtual address as a business address or registered agent. Okay, and some of these, and you know, we're going to try to answer as much as we can. Some of them may be more specific to actually talking to a business lawyer, but I would imagine that most of us, or most of these questions, we'll be able to address. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to get going with this. Therapists who are currently working as contractors getting a 1099, how much should one set aside for taxes?
We're going to go over all of that.
We're going to go over all this stuff. These are great questions, y'all, and keep them coming. You know, if the chat gets overloaded, we'll definitely sort through them and really try to get to all of them. And someone just posted a question. I have a CPA originally quoted me $600 a quarter, not including tax returns. Now quoted me $200 a quarter, not including tax returns. Is that a fair price? Okay, interesting. We'll try to answer that as well. I'm going to share my screen and then we're going to kind of get going, y'all. Sorry about that. So get this going. This is going to be a 2-day class. Today is going to be much more about accounting structure, business questions, kind of navigating those barriers in terms of starting a private practice. Tomorrow, I'm going to be going over how to choose a niche, writing content for your ideal client, marketing and networking strategies, working through imposter syndrome, which to be honest, I'm having that right now. My heart is beating fast. And we're going to go through a lot of that stuff tomorrow. If you do attend both sessions, if you like my Facebook page, Casale Coaching and Consulting, my Instagram page, Casale Coaching, and you like Josh's Facebook page, Sullivan Sullivan PLLC, you're going to be entered into a raffle to win a free tax return from Josh and a free coaching package from myself. And I will put that information in the chat when we get done with this. And we'll kind of move through that. So this is mainly for licensed mental health and addictions therapists who want to start their own businesses and leave their agencies. Also for licensed therapists, social workers who already are in private practice, and helping professionals who are looking for more clarity and direction in their professional life. Like I said, day one, more business side. Day two is going to be more of the therapeutic process side and how to actually navigate a lot of the barriers and the questions that come up in terms of how to create the niche, marketing and networking, imposter syndrome support, charging what you're worth, and a discussion on what are we selling to people and why is it valuable. So I am Patrick Casale. I live in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm a private practice coach and strategist, also a licensed mental health and addictions therapist in my own private practice. I actually help therapists take the leap from their agencies and start their private practices. I have a 6-week coaching course where I take 6 therapists through different themes that come up through private practice ownership, including but not limited to imposter syndrome, rate setting, cancellation policy enforcement, money mindset, writing content for your ideal clientele, marketing, and networking so you don't feel like a used car salesman, and all of those things. And I also offer an additional individual coaching in support of that. So I actually have a course starting Sunday the 13th. I have one spot left. If anyone's interested, please put your name in the chat and your email or your contact, and I will definitely be in touch with you. I also own Resilient Mind Counseling, which is a therapy business in Asheville, North Carolina, and Empowered Escape, trip planning and travel coaching business. The gentleman sitting across the hall from me is Josh Sullivan. I'm going to let him introduce himself. That was the best picture we could find on short notice. So I hope you enjoy that, because he sent me some other pictures that were kind of questionable.
You should have seen the ones that didn't make the cut. I absolutely am opposed to having my picture made, and I realize that's childish, but that was the best we could come up with on short notice. I thank Patrick earlier for not putting up a super professional headshot and then you know, making everyone look at this. My name is Josh Sullivan. I'm a CPA. I've been a CPA since about 2004. I worked for a large company for many years, and then went out on my own. So I did kind of the same thing that a lot of you guys are thinking about. So I know a lot of probably the questions and concerns that you guys are going through. I've been through them firsthand. So I went out in about 2010, 11, that time frame, started my own practice. So I've been doing that for about the last decade now. So thank you, Patrick, for having me on, and I'm glad to help you guys out today. Hope some of this is helpful to you, and will help you make some decisions going forward.
Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it. So we're not going to kind of do this right now. I just want to show you a glance about what we're going to talk about, because I'm going to allow Josh to just kind of freely kind of flow with what's going on and talking about quarterly taxes, what percentage goes where. A lot of people are going to say, I'm scared that I didn't save enough. Now what do I do? When should I hire an accountant, and what should I ask them? I think personally, you should hire an accountant almost immediately. A lot of people are going to go into private practice with the mindset that I need to save as much money as possible, have as little overhead as possible. And that's absolutely okay. But just reminding yourself that you're not an accountant or a tax professional. And a lot of this stuff is going to feel really scary and overwhelming. So to be able to have that support by your side, walking you through this process and making sure that the IRS isn't sending you a letter or knocking on your door in a couple months, is all the peace of mind in the world. I think it's a great relationship to have. I really believe that you should find accountants that understand therapy, that understand the private practice process. It's not a complicated business structure. It's very little overhead. It's more so about, like, we are working with people. We're really concerned about how we come across and how we impact their lives. We want to make sure that we have someone who's protecting our financial security and our ability to make money as well. We're going to talk about, of course, the LLC versus sole proprietorship conversation. A lot of people are going to talk about, how does this impact my liability? How much risk is involved if I go into business as a sole proprietor? What is a doing business as, or a DBA? We're going to talk about that stuff and how to transition from one to the other. I actually started as a sole proprietor in 2016 doing business as. So I transitioned to a PLLC last year. And I just want to say, it wasn't a hard process. I know there are a lot of people out there that feel really scared about that are going to say, well, a lawyer told me it could cost thousands of dollars to file my paperwork. I did all of my incorporation paperwork with the state myself. It is a little complicated, but it's definitely doable. And if you're in private practice, I want you to keep your money. I don't want you to outsource unless you really need that support, for an accountant, for a coach, for a biller. Like, really deciding, like, when do I want to delegate? When do I want to actually allocate my resources? Because some of this stuff you can do on your own and do it confidently. We're going to talk about EINs. That comes up a lot, obviously, an employee identification number. It's basically like a business social security number. What it's doing is it's protecting you when you're giving out billing documentation, especially for those of you who are going to give out super bills or bill insurance. You don't want your clients to have your social security number. I don't really have a good identity to steal at this point in time, but at the same time, I don't want them to have that information. The EIN just protects you, and it allows you to open up a bank account under a business name as well. You get it at the irs.gov for free. There are a lot of scams out there that try to charge you $50 to $100 to $200 to get an EIN. Please don't do those sites. Please use the IRS. It is free. It is easy. It takes about 2 minutes. We're going to talk about deductions, what count as business expenses. What about business lunches, the do's and don'ts, the things that you can write off versus you can't. And obviously in this COVID world and era, we're going to talk a little bit about the home office deduction as well. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to allow Josh to start talking, and I'm going to start looking through the comment section about questions, because I think that this is going to be a good place to start. So Josh, if you want to kind of take over and start, maybe we start with your take on the PLLC, LLC versus sole proprietorship in terms of how to start a business.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a little presentation queued up here too. I've already had some people ask if we will make these slides available. Absolutely can do that. Let's see here. That's not what I wanted to do.
Making you a co-host, Josh, so you can share.
Okay, maybe that's what it was. Okay, there we go. All right, let's see here. All right, can you see that? That screen? Okay, perfect. Yeah, we'll definitely talk about a lot of these questions that were already popping up. We will definitely get to that stuff. A lot of times when I start talking to counselors who are considering doing this, those are their first questions. You know, there's a lot of information out there that's like, what do I do about an LLC? Do I have to be a PLLC? What does all this even mean? How does this impact my liability? And one of the things that we work with people on is figuring out where you are in this process. So if you are just starting and you haven't done anything yet, then you can sort of judge where you are in that process on your own, and then make decisions. You know, maybe it doesn't make sense to become an LLC until later. You know, a lot of that is specific to you guys, but we're going to talk very generally about what the differences are in some of these different scenarios and different business structures, and then how that impacts you guys directly as counselors. Let's see here. Where is my slideshow's not working. Give me 1 second here. Let's see.
I can see it on my end when you're switching slides.
Can you see it? Okay.
Yep.
It wasn't switching slides on my side.
Yeah, I can see that. Can you see that?
It's not, my screen sharing's a little weird, but let's see here.
You're on business entity choices. So sole proprietorship versus partnership, incorporation, and limited liability.
Okay, if that gets off, Patrick, just let me know. My screen's looking a little weird here. Let's see here. Maybe this will help. Okay, still on that sole proprietorship screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right, so a lot of the questions we get are, okay, what are my options? You know, what does it mean to go into business even? Like, how do I start a business? And the quick answer is, if you start selling something and taking money for it, you're already in business. So that is usually the case with this first entity, which is a sole proprietorship. There's not a lot that you have to do to be considered a sole proprietor. Sole proprietors it's the easiest form of business to go into. You can, like I said, if you are out there conducting business and you haven't chosen any other form of business, by default, you are a sole proprietor. And that will just be the way it is. You can organize and do all of your business underneath your social security number, or you can have a federal ID number, even if you are a sole proprietor. But there's nothing really else that you have to do to become a sole proprietor other than just go into business, start putting whatever product it is out there. In the case of counselors, you guys all probably know at this point that you do have to do a little more than that. And what that means for you guys is, yes, you do have to make sure that you have compliance with licensing with your state organization, state board. You also are going to have professional liability insurance. That's required in most cases, unless you're working for someone else who's providing that. I don't know all the specifics on that, but generally that's something that you're required to have. So it's not as easy for you guys as it is for some people to go into business. But it's pretty simple. You know, if you have those things covered, then you can immediately start seeing patients or clients, or however you refer to them. If you go into business with someone else, even if you don't do any other work at that point, then you have a partnership with that person. This gets a lot more complicated right off the bat, because in most states, you are required to have a partnership agreement. That's a legal document that needs to be drawn up with someone. You know, everybody needs to have that spelled out. That needs to be drawn up by an attorney in most cases. If you have a partnership or you're going into business with someone, that is an extra step that you're going to need to go through.
Josh, let me jump in on the partnership side, if you don't mind. A lot of therapists that are going into private practice want to go into partnerships initially. And that's mainly because they're scared to go out on their own. So it feels a little bit safer to start a business with a friend, to start a business with a colleague, to start a business with someone you work with. So that's something that, you know, I would just be mindful of. I would not want that to prohibit you from going into business for yourself.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, and a lot of times there are different ways sort of to get around if you don't want to be in a partnership with someone, but you want to have a professional relationship with that person, that's super easy. I have a lot of other CPAs that I still do work with, but we're not fee sharing. We're not doing things like that. So there is, you know, you can have that support network as well without it being a legal entity. I accidentally stopped my screen share. Let me start that up again. Sorry, I'm a Zoom newbie. Let's see. Okay. And we want to.
Josh, we're getting a question that, can you apply for an EIN even if you're a sole proprietor? I believe the answer to that is yes, correct?
Yes, you can. You can. And that's one of the things that Patrick was talking about at the beginning, which is you have, there is an easy way directly through the IRS to apply for a federal ID number. Even if later you decide to change your business entity, you might have to reapply, or in some cases you can just transfer that business ID number. But we'll get into that a little more. Yes, you can do that, but there are some sort of pitfalls, especially if you start talking about when we start talking about insurance credentialing, because a lot of that stuff is based on that federal ID number or your social security number, which is one of the reasons we encourage people to go earlier for that federal ID number. There's not really a downside to that. But getting back to where we were before, so we talked about what a sole proprietorship is. Basically, that's just if you're in business on your own and you don't do anything else, by default, you kind of are a sole proprietor. If you're in business with someone else and you don't do anything else, by default, you're a partnership. And now we get into these two entities that you have to apply to become the corporation and the limited liability company. It used to be that not every state had a limited liability company, or for a lot of you guys, and in some states, not all, it will be called a PLLC, because you have to go through your state board for help in getting this status of limited liability company. We're going to talk a lot about the LLC or the PLLC, so we'll get to that in a minute. I only talk about the corporation here because there might be some of you that have already got an S-corp, or you just straight incorporated instead of going through an LLC. That's fine too. We'll kind of talk about those entities. The C-corp is usually not a an organizational choice that we see made very often for counselors, but it wouldn't be, crazy to think of. But we're going to be talking a lot about the sole proprietorship and the LLC, and then how that relates to this entity specifically called an S-corp. So we're going to be talking a lot about that. I've already mentioned a lot of these things. The sole proprietor is just how it will be if you go into business and you don't do anything else. For tax purposes, you will be considered a sole proprietor. If you've ever gotten paid with a 1099 and filed your own tax return and had to do that Schedule C, that business income, that's how you'll report your tax return if you are a sole proprietor. It's cheap. That's a great benefit. There's not a lot of legal work that you have to do necessarily. You guys, like I said before, will have to do some work with your state board and make sure that your licensing and credentialing and all that stuff is right. There's a low amount of administrative effort because you're not having to go through all of this organizing and LLC and all that stuff. So it's easy, it's cheap, that you don't have a lot of extra reports and stuff that the IRS is going to want to see. It's more flexible than other entities because you're not even necessarily required to get a different bank account, although we'll get to that later. It's always a good idea to split your business outside of your personal, even if you are a sole proprietor. And for a lot of people, this is as far as it will ever go, as far as them being in business. For whatever reason, this is what works for them. I see this with counselors, with a lot of times with people who are doing it kind of as a side gig. And I don't mean that in any way to diminish if you're just thinking about doing this on the side. Some of the things we're going to talk about as far as a tax strategy might not be beneficial enough to you to overcome additional headaches and administrative costs. So we see this for a lot of people who are, they have another job, or they have kids, they're working part-time, or, whatever the reason is, taking care of a sick parent. They're only seeing a few clients a week, and the sole proprietor can be a great business model for those guys that are in that situation. But for all of you who are thinking about doing this full time, you'll see what we're talking about, where this is not always the most advantageous business choice or business entity from a tax standpoint. But for administrative, all that stuff, it's very cheap. A lot of times you don't have to do anything. And, I get a lot of questions about what about liability protection? I have liability insurance. Shouldn't that be enough? And the answer is yes, it could be enough. But that depends on maybe your individual situation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to these other business entities. So we're kind of skipping to the LLC because this is the one that a lot of people, it's a very flexible business entity. And a lot of people, when they are thinking about going into business, the most asked question I get is, should I go ahead and form this LLC or PLLC in your state if they require that? And the answer is, and you're going to hear me say this a lot, with the only right answer to every tax question is it depends. And so it depends on there is no one answer that works for everyone. And I see this with a lot when people are asking questions online and people that are responding to them, and they're like, hey, you should do this because it worked for me. And that's, I think people are giving out generally, trying to be helpful and giving out good advice. But the only right answer to this is talk to someone and figure out if it's right for you. Because what might have been right for that person in their situation could be the complete wrong answer, or it might be too early for you to be considering that. And the fact of the matter is, with most of these business entities, they are fairly flexible. You don't have to make all these decisions right up front. So talk to someone. That's kind of goes back to what Patrick said earlier. It's like, talk to someone, help make these decisions so that you don't have to worry about it, and you can get back to being a counselor and get back to helping people and leave this stuff alone, and set aside time to think about it so you're not always kind of wondering about it. And so with an LLC, that's the entity that we see most counselors pursuing, the business entity choice that we see most people pursuing. The difference in an LLC and a PLLC, LLC obviously means limited liability company. The PLLC simply means professional limited liability company. In a state in North Carolina is this way. Patrick and I are both in North Carolina, and the way that it works here is that when you want to form an LLC as someone who has a professional license, attorneys, doctors, accountants, architects, counselors, a lot of different people fall under this window. And if your state's like this, that you will probably have to do this as well. We're required to go through our state board to form a business. And when they do form that, it forms as this PLLC rather than an LLC. But for tax purposes, they're the same thing. That is one question we get is like, should I do the PLLC or an LLC? And the answer there is going to be, well, you're going to need to figure that out in the state you're filing in. If you are in North Carolina, then you are going to have to be a PLLC if you're going into counseling. And it is work that you're going to be doing underneath your license. So for tax purposes, you know, what happens when I put an LLC in place? Well, if you're the only member of it, the answer is absolutely nothing. There is nothing that happens from a tax standpoint just simply by organizing an LLC. The IRS doesn't look at an LLC as a legitimate business entity. They look to see what's underneath it. So if you're the only member of that business, then they're saying, well, for tax purposes, we're still going to consider you a sole proprietor. But having the LLC allows you to make an election down the road that you can't do as a sole proprietor. And we'll get to that in a second. An LLC can be good for certain industries or certain tax situations where we just want the LLC in place for either the tax benefits or if we want the LLC in place, you know, for liability protection. And a lot of times we see LLCs that are operating as sole proprietorships. A lot of times people will hold real estate in those. So if you ever get to the point, or if you are already at the point where you're like, I want to buy an office building or something like that, LLCs can be very good for separating that from your practice. Obviously, if you were to get sued for someone tripping and falling, you don't want all that stuff bundled up together. And this is how the LLC can start to help separate that. This is, as Patrick alluded to earlier, this is more of a legal question. As far as how much or, you know, in what circumstances is the LLC going to provide more protection than a sole proprietor? I know, and don't in any way take this as legal advice, but the reason that people do this is because if you are just a sole proprietor and you have all this stuff in one place, they can just sue you individually and they're suing everything. If you were to get sued in a limited liability company, you're hopefully limiting that lawsuit and its repercussions to the assets that are in that entity. So you're trying to keep this stuff from spreading. That's the whole point of these from a legal standpoint. But as you'll see in a little bit, these will give us some additional tax strategies.
I just want to jump in and answer some questions that I'm seeing in the chat because I'm seeing a theme here about sole proprietorship. A lot of people are asking, you know, do I have to do anything with my board as a sole proprietor? And no, the answer is no. In most states, you do not. The PLLC, like Josh said, you are going to have to apply through your licensing board. That is a process that each individual state has specifically to them. So in North Carolina, I had to apply as a PLLC through the board. They approved it, sent me the paperwork, which I then had to send to the state to incorporate as a PLLC. It's a process, but it's not, it sounds complicated, just like anything else sounds complicated when we don't know how to do it. And it feels a bit overwhelming. So I don't want anyone to get overwhelmed by this. I just want you to really hear that this is a process that if you have a good, supportive professional in your corner, you'll be able to walk through it, no problem, no questions asked. This is something that shouldn't scare you from doing any of this right now.
Exactly. Yeah. All of this stuff, and you know, I saw somebody ask earlier, like, do I need to be taking notes? You know, and yes, we will make these slides available to you. Also, you know, I was telling people, like, make notes just about questions that you think about yourself and your situation, and you know, and how these might apply, because, like I said before, it's going to be very unique to your situation. The S-corp is either an entity that can be formed if you just incorporate rather than form an LLC, or it can be an entity that you elect to have an LLC you elect for the tax treatment of the LLC to be as an S corporation. And there are some pretty substantial benefits. Oops, I went forward too far. There are some pretty substantial benefits of the S-corp for tax purposes. We can get into that later about how those are actually calculated. The main thing when determining whether or not you can be an S-corp is you cannot be a sole proprietor and then elect to be taxed as an S corporation. You either have to have incorporated or you have to have an LLC formed. So that is the main benefit early on, aside from maybe, that's the main benefit for tax purposes, I'll say that. There can be some other benefits, especially if you're taking insurance. But that's the main benefit of forming the LLC early on, is that at that point, going forward, you can work with your tax professional to determine when is the right time to perhaps make the jump to S-corp. I have had a few people who are still working for agencies and being paid as independent contractors who want to know if they can form an LLC and then be taxed as an S-corp. And that is going to depend on their relationship with that agency and whether or not that can happen. I've seen it happen and seen it work. And then I've seen some agencies that are like, because of our insurance and credentialing and all that stuff, we cannot pay your LLC or a different tax ID number. But for those of you who are going into private practice, this is absolutely a decision that you need to work with someone to make, because if you are a sole proprietor or an LLC who has not made this election, you are going to be paying all of your self-employment tax and income tax in, and that can get substantial very quickly for some of the same reasons that Patrick talked about earlier, that you guys don't have a lot of overhead. So when you get to the point of seeing a full load of patients, your net income, or the income that you're taxed on, can grow very quickly. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. The S-corp provides the same type of legal protection as an LLC. You know, if you incorporate and then elect to be an S-corp, you know, versus like forming an LLC and then electing to have the LLC be taxed as an S-corp. I don't know exactly if one provides more legal protection than the other. That might be a good question to ask an attorney, but I think probably it's going to be similar. If you're ever concerned about that based on your individual situation, you know, it wouldn't hurt to ask an attorney, you know, should I do this versus LLC? But the LLC that is being taxed as an S-corp, or the corporation being taxed as an S-corp, for tax purposes, they're exactly the same. And that entity, when it does not pay any tax on its own, aside from maybe some state franchise tax that will be for anybody that's in business. But that entity, the S-corp or the LLC, they pay tax at the rate of the owner. So these are called, if you hear me talk about a flow-through entity, that's what I'm talking about. You file a tax return for your business, and then the income and expenses from that flow through to your personal tax return, and that's where the income tax is calculated. And we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about the actual benefits of what an S-corp can do for you.
Hey, Josh.
Yeah, go ahead.
We've got a couple of questions, and I want to also address some stuff that's coming up in the chat. A lot of people are saying you can't see the questions, but you can see my answers. Make sure that you have all panelists and attendees turned on instead of all panelists in terms of the chat. Secondly, we have some questions that have come in, and I want to open them to discussion right now while they're coming in. Someone says, I'm in New York and a lawyer told me that a PLLC doesn't protect me from being sued for my actions. It only protects me from the actions of my partners. If I have partners, is this true? I decided to go for a sole proprietorship based on this advice. Any ideas?
I don't know if, I mean, again, the LLC will certainly not keep you from being sued.
Right.
But I've been told by attorneys that one of the reasons that you can, like, if you are a sole proprietor versus having your business operating as an LLC, they can come after your personal assets easier if you are not in an LLC than they can if you're just a sole proprietor. Like,
Right.
you know, when you're a sole proprietor, there's no separation from, say, let's say you have a house or investments or those kinds of things. That's the kinds of things that we're trying to protect with these business entities. If you are in a partnership and you are in business with someone else, again, the choice is not whether or not you're going to be a sole proprietor or, you know, or an LLC or a sole proprietor. If you're in business with someone else, you're either going to be a partnership or you're going to be an S-corp or something. You know, if you're in business with someone else, you can't be a sole proprietor. You're by default a partnership. So if what you said was, hey, I was told that, you know, just forming this LLC with another person won't protect me, so I just did my own thing. That's a decision not to go into business with the other person. Does that make sense? So that's a little bit different question. Maybe if I didn't answer that right, let me know. But yeah, going into business with someone else, if you do that, whether formally or informally, honestly, like, you have formed a partnership. And so there are a lot of different rules that govern partnerships that aren't the same as to sole proprietors. The partnerships are generally like the least flexible business entity because they're governed by their partnership agreement. And that partnership agreement, if you are considering going into business with a partner, you need to have an operating agreement or a partnership agreement drawn up by an attorney, because that spells out what happens when things are going well. It also spells out what happens when things aren't going well. And most of the time when I see partnerships go sour, it's not because they're getting sued by a client, it's because they're not getting along well together. And so that partnership agreement is there to protect you and your other partner, not only from whatever business you're engaged in, or, you know, making sure that the business structure is solid, but it's also like helps you guys know what to do if one of you wants to leave, or like what happens if someone, you know, becomes ill and can't work anymore. You know, it handles all of those. The operating agreement handles all of those questions. And if you don't have one, then people end up in court settling this up. So if you have a partnership or you're considering a partnership, get an attorney involved from the start and let them guide you through the process of forming that partnership agreement. Patrick, were there any other questions that you wanted to go ahead and address right now?
We've got some other questions, but I can bring them up at the end of this. So
okay.
What I do want to say, everyone, is most of you are not going to be in partnerships initially. Starting out, you're probably going to be an LLC, PLLC, or a sole proprietor. So really don't let this language get lost on you. I know when we're thinking about accounting, like, that's not the world we live in. So that feels really like overwhelming in a lot of ways to know that there are all these options. Just know that it's pretty basic and straightforward as to, are you going to be a sole proprietor? Are you going to be a PLLC or an LLC that elects to become an S-corp? So I just really want everyone to know that. I've got a bunch of questions coming in. For y'all that I can't get to the questions right away, we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So if I don't get to your question, just let me know. Someone asks, if I began as an independent contractor with a group practice, paid as a 1099 employee, this year have gotten a PLLC and I'm electing as an S-corp, do I need to clarify this with the owner of the group practice? Does he need to pay me as Dr. B PLLC and not Dr. B as she did in 2018 and 19?
That was what I was just addressing a minute ago. It depends. To be sort of rock solid in that arrangement, yes, you would want to have your income coming into your S-corp. At that point, your PLLC that you have elected S for, that has a different federal ID number. It can cause some issues with credentialing and might lead them to say that they can't do it. I've seen that happen. I've also seen people that are like, we don't care, you know. If they pay you and then you put that money into the S-corp, I've seen that happen. It happens all the time with people who open corporations and never update their federal ID number. You know, sometimes the IRS gets bent out of shape about substance over form issues or form over substance issues. And they're like, hey, if this is coming to you personally, then you should be treating it just as your normal sole proprietor income. I've also seen them look at that and say, hey, if this is being deposited into your business account and they just didn't update your number, then yeah, we'll let you pick it up. But there are some things on your tax return that you might need to be aware of if you're getting paid, because if you get a 1099 at the end of the year, it's probably going to be still under your personal name. And if you don't claim that income, then it can cause some matching errors and some difficulties with the IRS.
Definitely.
But there are some ways around that, because that's a pretty common mistake, that people will either not update your 1099 to your federal ID number that you've gotten and then form the LLC under. But as a general rule, I would say yes, you want to ask before doing that. They shouldn't really care as far as it goes with how you are treating your own taxes. But for sometimes with the insurance companies and credentialing and things like that, it seems that there can be some issues. And I've seen people balk at wanting to pay another entity. And I think, again, it's usually because of like liability insurance and credentialing issues. So you might want to check with them before that. And that's also, it doesn't mean if they say, hey, we can't do this, we can't make the 1099 or the payments to this person or this new entity, it doesn't mean that they might not be able to do that in the future. It might just mean that there needs to be some stuff done over time to make that happen. So I hope that's helpful. Let us know if it's not. Let's see.
So I had a question come in asking about out-of-state licensure, and you can only see clients in the states that you are licensed, okay? You can't see clients like that live in California if you're only licensed in North Carolina. Your clients have to be physically in the state that you are licensed. You personally can be anywhere. You could be anywhere in the world seeing your clients, provided that you're licensed in specific states. You could be in Australia providing service to someone in North Carolina if you're licensed in North Carolina. Your client, though, has to be in the state physically, boots on the ground in the state that you are licensed in. Really something to try to remember, especially in this telehealth world. Another question, Josh, is if I have licensure in multiple states, I'm licensed, say, in North Carolina and Colorado, I live in North Carolina, I'm seeing clients in both states, where do I pay taxes?
The short answer, again, it depends. It's a little different for different industries. Just because if you are licensed in another state, then the chances are that you are going to have to pay some tax to that state. There is a way when you are doing a tax return to do what's called a state allocation of your income and expenses. And essentially what that does is it says, okay, let's say I made $100,000 during the year and I made $20,000 in, did you say Colorado in this example? Let's say I made $20,000 in Colorado and $80,000 in North Carolina. Then there's a way to do a breakdown. And it's not as simple as just saying, okay, 20% goes to Colorado and 80% goes to North Carolina. But that's essentially like that gets to the heart of it. Like there is an allocation that is performed, and based on the two states or even more than that, frankly, that are in play, then that will say, okay, here's the percentage of your net income that we're going to allocate to either North Carolina or Colorado. A lot of the states that you are a resident of, if you're a resident of North Carolina, for example, they're going to tax 100% of your income from everywhere. But if you pay state tax to Colorado, then they will give you a credit for that on the North Carolina side. There's not income tax in every state, so sometimes North Carolina and states that do that will get more than their share, sort of just the way it is. It's not 100% fair, but also if you're in a state that has a higher tax rate than North Carolina, then you're going to get more of a credit back from that. But the short answer is yes, probably if you are doing business and are registered to do business in a state, then you are probably going to have to pay tax there. It's a little bit of a gray issue, to be honest, but especially with, now with telehealth becoming to the forefront, we're probably going to see some more guidelines going forward about what creates this term that you'll hear called nexus. Nexus is what you have to have with a state in order to have to pay tax there. And increasingly with online tools, it's much easier to create nexus than it was in the past. And those states all want their share. So they're trying to make this easier and easier to tax people from out of state who are doing business there. But generally speaking, if you have a license to do business somewhere and then you are using that license to do business with someone in that state, they're going to view you as doing business in the state. If you are marketing your services there specifically, that's another, that would be another reason to say, hey, you're going to have to pay some tax to this state.
So for those of you who are licensed in multiple states, I hope you heard what Josh just said, that you're going to have to be mindful about how you allocate at the end of the year when you're filing your taxes, that there's probably a good chance that you're going to pay some state tax to the state that you're licensed in that you don't physically live in. And that's just something you're going to have to go over with your accountant specifically. And I'd be asking those questions off the bat if you're licensed in multiple states. Josh, another question that I think is important that comes up a lot is, do you need to apply for an EIN before applying for an LLC or PLLC?
It's not necessary. You do not have, in fact, if you have an EIN number, there's a good chance that you might have to get a new EIN number for the new business entity. So typically the order of operations is that you would form your LLC, because that involves a name check and all that stuff. So you form that LLC. That LLC at that point is doing business as you anyway, because you've made no elections. So it can continue to use your social security number. But you have to form the LLC and have the name registered with the state, et cetera, before you can apply for a federal ID number. So typically the order of operations is to apply for apply for the LLC and get that approved, then apply for the federal ID number second. And after you have those two things, you can do things like get a business bank account, et cetera. So
just to clarify, everyone, if you're going to become a PLLC or LLC, you're essentially doing that process, sending your paperwork to the state to ensure that that name can be incorporated with the state, that no one else has it, that they don't kick it back. And then you would apply for the EIN number once you have the paperwork stating you are a PLLC or LLC in the state. So correct. I know that some people jump the gun and will just get the EIN number under the proposed name for the LLC or PLLC. You're kind of risking it and gambling that if you do it that way. Just wanting you to know that the state could kick it back and say, hey, we are not going to approve this.
Well, you might have to, I don't know if they wouldn't approve it, but you might have to just you might have to apply for another federal ID number and then sort of terminate the old one. You don't really have to do anything with that, but you can get some tax notices if you have multiple federal ID numbers floating around out there. You want to stay away from that if you can. It can also cause issues. And Patrick, maybe you can even speak a little with your own experience with this, but when you form this new LLC, or even if you're a sole proprietor and you get a federal ID number, there is some work that if you're taking insurance, it can cause some issues with your credentialing, and that can cause a delay in payments. And that's often, in a lot of this, the most, I guess the process that's the biggest headache, because it can just take a long time for those insurance companies to process this stuff, and it can delay your payments. It can be kind of a pain in the neck, which
it can create a real mess. Like a real mess. Like, I went from being a sole proprietor and talked to Josh about this process, about becoming a PLLC and how it would impact Blue Cross Blue Shield and Aetna, et cetera. And although they don't care what type of business entity you are, a sole proprietorship or an LLC, the insurance companies don't care. But what they do care about is your name change and your EIN change. So what you're doing is you're submitting a demographic change form to each insurance company saying, hey, my new business name is no longer Patrick Casale. It's, whatever, Counseling PLLC, and my EIN is now this. I really want everyone to hear this. Do not bill a single claim until you get confirmation that your insurance company has confirmed that and changed that. Otherwise, you are subject to back pay, clawbacks, where they come back and take money because they're paying the inappropriate EIN or business ID. Just be really mindful of that. It's not a hard process. It's just a matter of I've got to submit the paperwork appropriately. And in order to become
that's one reason that like sort of following the order of operations can hopefully minimize that. If you're already in business and you want to make the jump to the LLC or the S-corp or something like that, then that's just part of the process that you're going to have to go through.
That's right. And you can do it smoothly and seamlessly. It's just a matter of like Josh said, order of operations. Someone asks, in order to be an LLC, I will need both a business address and registered agent address. Do you know if I can use a virtual address for one or both since I'm doing telehealth? So that's a big question right now in the telehealth world and the COVID world. A lot of people not wanting to enter in their home address or office address because they don't want clients to be able to find them. There are ways around it. There are like people will use a USPS or UPS PO box, a virtual office address. They will sublet an office virtually from a friend and just use that address as their billing address. What I will tell you is some insurance companies are catching on to that and turning you down from credentialing. They're getting very slick to the fact that you are just working out of your home, but not using your home address. I'm going to tell you this. If I was to Google your name in your city, I'm probably going to find out where you live. For all of you that are scared to use your home address as your billing address or your office address in the COVID era. If you have a mortgage, if you have tax return, if you're voting, you're in a Google search. You're able to be found. So I just want you to know that. And also, if you use a virtual address, it's not going to incorporate with Google as much so that you can't be found via SEO and Google search. So I just want you to know that it makes it a lot more complicated. Josh, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I mean, yeah, with all those things, there are definitely there are upsides and downsides to those. I know in North Carolina on the LLC form, and they want your registered agent address, which can be you as well. They want, your principal business mailing address, and then they want your physical location. Like they ask for all of that stuff. And the reason the states are asking for that is because they want to know for sure that this is, a real thing, that if they need to track you down, that they can. I understand and sympathize with not wanting to have your personal address out there. And especially in this day and age with where a lot of people are moving away from having physical office locations, it does bring up some interesting dilemmas. If there's any reason to, to maybe want to sort of cloak your physical location. Again, I think there probably are some ways to do that are legal and, are not going to get you in trouble with your credentialing or whatever. But that might be something that you want to run, you want to talk about with your state board. I know that there are probably better state boards out there than others, but a lot of these questions, there probably will be someone who can help you with that, especially as it relates to your industry specifically. If you call them and say, hey, I really don't want to have my physical address on there because I have some, problematic clients and, whatever your situation is, I guarantee you they've run into it before and they can kind of point you in the right direction. So don't forget, you pay dues to these guys, make them earn a little bit of it, because if you don't ever ask them any questions, they're not gonna know. Again, it is a bureaucracy. I'm sure it's different in every state, but, reach out with some of those questions directly to them and see what they say, because I bet that they've got some sort of best practices that have been vetted. And then you're not like hiring an attorney right off the bat to ask them all these questions and maybe not getting as relevant an answer anyway. So reach out to your board in your specific state for a lot of those questions and say, hey, I'm running into this situation. What's your advice? That's supposed to be what they're there for. So if they're at the least they can do is point you in the right direction. So,
someone asks, if your name is approved for an LLC in one state, does it transfer to another state and still being approved? I would imagine that you would have to reapply in a different state and incorporate there as well.
It depends. If you are doing business in multiple states, a lot of times you are required to file paperwork in that state, registering it's usually referred to as a foreign or an alien LLC. And that just simply means that LLC was not formed in that state. So in our North Carolina, Colorado example, if you have a North Carolina LLC and then you're doing business in Colorado, you'll have to check with Colorado's Secretary of State But generally speaking, they want you to register as a foreign company or foreign business entity doing business in that state. And then there's usually a small annual fee. It's really expensive in some states though. In California, I think it's the minimum fee you'll pay is like $800 a year. And then there's some states that there probably isn't any fee at all. So that's just going to be different state to state, but you'll need to check if you're doing business in multiple states. Especially for you guys in the Northeast where, you might have a bunch of different states, right close to you. The interstate issues can be a big deal for some of you guys. So just talk to a professional, get their advice on your specific situation. And then if you need to, sometimes there might not even be a need to file for doing business as, but in your case where you have to get credentialed and licensed in each state, that's probably ticking some boxes towards having nexus and needing to file taxes in that state. So it can be the same with your LLC, needing to register as a foreign corporation doing business.
Definitely. Brant, you asked the differences between an MPI 1 and 2. An MPI 1, a national provider identifier number, is a personal national provider identifier. It's your own MPI. It's an individual provider. You could get that as a sole proprietor. You can also get that as a sole owned PLLC or LLC. An MPI 2 is an organizational MPI where you are billing as an entity or an organization or a group. And you can do that individually. And each insurance company is going to be a little bit different as to whether or not they make you get an MPI 2 or not. You should absolutely have an MPI 1 because that will be your provider ID, your personalized one. Some states and some insurance companies will make you get an MPI 2 as well and bill as a group, even if it's just you as yourself. So it's specific to insurance companies. But if you're in private practice on your own, you should absolutely have an MPI 1. And the MPI 2 is much more specific to group practice. I've got some other questions up here, Josh, so let me get to those. Actually, those have been answered. Okay, if you want to keep going, feel free. I don't know where we left off.
Let's see here. I think we were sort of talking about, let me get to my right screen here. There we go. We were sort of just still going through the business entities. The last one I'll talk about, and we'll only talk about this briefly because we don't see it very often with counselors, is just if you incorporate. There used to be states where the LLC was not a valid business entity choice. I don't think that there are any states where you can't be an LLC, but I could be wrong. If you're in a state where you cannot, for some reason, form as an LLC, but you want to take advantage of some of the tax benefits of being an S-corp, then what you have to do in those states is simply incorporate and then elect to have your corporation taxed as an S-corp. Once you decide to be an S-corp or a C-corp, you have to file, or if you're a partnership, but if you're an S-corp or a C-corp, you have to file separate tax returns for that entity. That's one of the things that will lead to increased administrative costs and why those entity choices are more expensive, but they can give you far more benefit in tax savings than those administrative costs, which is what we'll get to in a minute. If you are incorporated, basically the only way that you can take compensation from that entity is by making yourself an employee of your company. Any tax that, because of the last tax law that was passed in 2017, corporations pay a flat tax of 21%. If you add your payroll into any income tax, that can make all of that income tax at an extremely high rate. But yeah, so we don't see this very often at all. Maybe there are some agencies out there that are taxed as corporations that are bigger businesses, but I haven't really run into that a lot. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the incorporation. And we'll go back and talk a little bit more in a bit, maybe about the S-corp stuff and about how that can save you some money. I want to talk a little bit about record keeping. That's probably, after we have the LLC versus sole proprietor conversation, the next thing that people ask me is like, what should I be doing to keep up with this stuff? You know, I've heard a lot of people that are like, if you're a sole proprietor, you don't need to keep good records. It really doesn't matter. You just need to have, like, basic profit and loss that you work off of. I would argue that all entity choices require some good records. That does not mean that this is something that you have to outsource. The best records that I've seen kept for counselors are most of the time kept by the counselors themselves. Most of you guys are going to have super simple bookkeeping, especially if you follow bullet point number 3 here. And this is the big one. Whoops, clicked on it. This is the big one. You need to separate your bank accounts. Even if you're a sole proprietor, get the business out of your personal bank accounts so that you're not having to dig through every single transaction every month to figure out what is deductible, what is not. Get your business activity into your business bank account if at all possible. You'll probably still have a few things that spill over, or you'll make a mistake where you bought something with the wrong debit card, etc. That's all fine. But you really want to separate this stuff. It will make your life a whole lot easier. You're just classifying all those transactions down to where if you're really using just the business bank account for business stuff, then you don't have to go through all of this, all of your personal expenses and sort of try to pull them out. You're going to miss stuff if you do that. You're going to make more mistakes. And then what you can do if you need money in your personal account is just do an owner distribution. Just transfer money from your business bank account to your personal bank account and pay all your personal expenses out of that personal bank account. And the business bank account is just going to be for business income and expenses. I can't stress that enough. If you don't do anything else, do that alone. And at the end of the year, when you sit down to try to figure all this stuff out, which you should be doing it more often than that, but if that's what you choose to do, and you get to the end of the year, you only have one bank account that'll have probably fairly minimal transactions in it to go through. A lot of people ask me, should I buy accounting software? Do I need accounting software? And the answer is, it's up to you. I usually tell people, I'm good at using accounting software. I do it for a living. So to me, if I was starting a business, yes, I would. But a lot of people are sort of like, this is just one more thing that I have to learn to do right now. So if you're going into business, especially if you're just a sole proprietor, especially when you're not maybe super busy, I see a lot of people that just start a Google spreadsheet and they're tracking all of their income and expenses in that. And it can be super simple I usually do it by 1 month at a time. And then you just have your expenses across the top of the spreadsheet and then totaled up underneath that. And same thing with your income. For a lot of people, that's probably going to be enough. If you have multiple people working for you and you have multiple owners or you have payroll, all that stuff, you're probably going to need some accounting software at that point. There are a lot of online products. Some of them are free. The free ones have usually very limited reporting. A lot of times people use the QuickBooks products. I'm very familiar with those. Those can become expensive. So I, tell people not to buy one of those until they need them. But there's a whole list of those products out there that you can determine if it's right for you, and work with your tax professional to figure that out. It usually should be pretty simple. Most of the time, the other thing I get is, when I'm talking to an accountant, I want them to handle all of this. If you outsource all of your bookkeeping to an accountant, it shouldn't be, especially if you're just one person seeing, let's say 20 to 25 clients a week, and you're going to have pretty much the same expenses, the same types of income. The bookkeeping for this is very simple. It shouldn't be very expensive. That said, if you outsource 100% of it, you probably are going to be paying, there's a minimum fee that an accountant's going to charge you to keep up with that stuff and to get it onto their radar. And I think for most people, especially starting out, that's overkill. But, and I've told people too, it's like a lot of times I end up going through people's bank accounts and asking them, I'm like, hey, what's this? What's this? And so they're kind of doing the bookkeeping anyway, and then they're paying me to do it. And I've got them because they're the only people who know what's going on. So, stay current with it. It's part of being in business. It's part of doing this. And if you need some help, get it. Like if this is becoming something, then you're like, I'm never going to do that. Just get some help. But you know, if you're paying somebody to monthly be in your books, number one, it shouldn't be super complicated for that person to keep up with. It should be fairly simple. And if they're doing that every month, also you should probably be getting some, I would say at least slight breaks on your tax prep. That kind of, it would depend on what else you have going on, but the numbers should be ready by that point. You know, like I say, get help if you can't keep up. But I work with a lot of people, sometimes with some of these accounting products, and I show them kind of how to use stuff. And I say, here's what you need to do. And they're like, oh, I can do that. And, you know, it's taking me less than 30 minutes a month to keep up with this stuff. It really, for most of you guys, is not going to be a huge time suck. If it is becoming one, then get some help.
Got a couple questions that I want to shoot over to you. Katie's asking if we can create a simple Excel spreadsheet with formulas in it. I suck at Excel. Josh mentioned someone using a simple spreadsheet to track their expenses. That's me. I track my expenses on a simple spreadsheet. I add it up. I give it to Josh. He creates the magic in the tax world. So someone said, do you need more extensive bookkeeping if you are an LLC individually? I don't think so, right?
It depends on how complex things are getting. If you become an LLC and you don't do anything else, then no, you're still a sole proprietor. You can probably still get away with just, you know, dropping all your income and expenses in a spreadsheet. I think that's fine. If you start getting multiple things happening, like payroll, if you put another person on payroll, if you start getting into where you're trying to track a bunch of different things, you'll end up spending more time on the spreadsheet than you would just learning some simple tricks and tools with a product like QuickBooks. So I would say starting out as an LLC, you don't really have to do anything different, because remember, the LLC by itself does not make your tax situation change at all. You're still going to be considered a sole proprietor for tax purposes. But if you make the jump from an LLC from sole proprietor to an S-corp, then that does require some different numbers. I still have plenty of clients that just keep track of all their stuff in a spreadsheet. One thing I'll say about that is if you have all the stuff in a spreadsheet, I'm only looking usually at raw data at that point. So if you've made mistakes, I'm not necessarily as a tax pro going to see those. I might not see them anyway. We're not there at tax time to correct all of your mistakes necessarily. That's not something that we're looking to do. We will correct stuff we see, and there are certain adjustments that we always make. But if you just give someone raw data and they see supplies X number, and then you've put a bunch of stuff in supplies that shouldn't be there, and that goes on the tax return, and then down the road you get audited and they're like, hey, what's in your supplies number? And then all of a sudden we look and see that it's got your mortgage payment and your trips to the movie theater and all that stuff in it. We would have never seen that or even had the opportunity to see it. So if you're just pulling, if you're not going to get some help in how to set that stuff up and some help in determining what is deductible, or simply give some, some extra data from where your transactions came from, then it can be hard for your CPA to know, one, if you're doing things correctly, or two, if there's things that you're leaving out. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. So I'm hearing separation, separation, separation.
Yeah, get it out of your, no matter what you do, get a separate bank account. If you are a person that uses credit cards for your business expenses, which can be a smart strategy, especially, if you've got something you like to travel, running business expenses through those credit cards can be a good way to like bank up points. Obviously, you want to try to keep that stuff paid off and not get killed on interest. But if you've got different methods of payment, Venmo, all that stuff, get separate ones for your business as far as from you personally. Like, get this stuff separated. You'll be thankful that you did in the long run. It can be kind of a pain to have multiple accounts, but you need to do it. I mean, if you have to do anything, get a separate business account for your bank account, get a separate business credit card, all of that stuff, get it separate, put all of this stuff in one place so that when you're going back and looking at it, you've got all the data. Because when you're working with someone to determine am I deducting everything I can? Well, if you've got stuff in 500 different places, everybody's going to miss stuff when it comes to that. And
right.
so you can save yourself money and a lot of headaches down the road by getting all this stuff into like separate buckets.
Yep. Cynthia, you asked if EHRs like Simple Practice can transfer into spreadsheets. So they will run a report at the end of the year with all of your taxable income, all of the income that you brought in, et cetera, and then you can incorporate that. Someone asked if you should get a separate bank account or specifically a business bank account. I think you just answered that. Business bank account is the better way to go.
Well, if you get a federal ID number, a lot of times they will not let you open a personal bank account in that. Business bank accounts can come with more fees. And I have people all the time who are like, I'm a sole proprietor. I don't have a separate bank account. Do I need to get a business bank account? They won't give me one without a federal ID number. And in that case, I don't really care. I'm sure the banks might not like it if you're conducting business out of a personal account. And I've seen people get busted doing that. And then what they do is they just move them to a business bank account anyway. So, if you don't have a federal ID number, it's going to probably be hard to set up a business bank account. And a lot of times, at that point, your only choice is to get another personal bank account. I'm fine with that from the tax side. Like I said, the banks might have an issue with that. But
right.
If you're concerned about that, just tell them what you're doing and let them tell you what kind of account you need to be in. From a tax side, you just want this stuff separated.
Yep. All right. Good stuff. Let's keep it going. We've got about probably 15, 20 more minutes of this presentation. Then we're going to answer a lot more questions. So I'm probably going to pause on answering questions live until the end, but I will continue to answer them in the chat.
Yeah. And we've already been over a lot of this too. So I'll try to get to these questions sooner than later. But I want to talk about a few considerations specifically for counselors. Patrick, if you hear of any, or if you have any that I didn't put on this list, like jump in. The one thing I get asked a lot is, is there any difference between insurance and private pay? And, you guys honestly probably know more about that than I do. Insurance companies are going to reimburse you what they feel like. Private pay, it's up to you and your client to figure out what that rate is. And I have a lot of people that, they sort of do it on ability to pay. I'm fine with all of that. From a tax standpoint, the insurance, what they reimburse you is income, and what the private pay people pay you is income. With the insurance companies, you obviously have to get credentialed. There's a lot more paperwork. There is, but, I was talking with someone the other day and they said, I really only want to do private pay, but I feel like I'm turning my back on people. And I understand where that's coming from, because people have insurance and they're already paying for that. And then they can't afford to pay for more outside of that. That's going to have to be your personal decision-making process. I get both sides of that. I get why people don't want to have anything to do with insurance companies. And I also get why people are like, I want to be able to take insurance companies because some of my clients are not going to be able to pay me just through private pay. I get both sides of that. I'll leave that up to you guys. There's no right or wrong answer in my opinion there. I appreciate the people who don't want to have the headache of insurance companies. It is a headache. I mean, there's no short way around that. And if you take Medicaid or Medicare clients, you've got to get credentialed with those organizations as well. So it can be a lot of work. You guys, like I said, probably know more about that than I do, but I don't think there's a right or wrong answer on that. It really just depends on what your specific situation is.
Can I jump in on that? So
sure.
The private pay insurance conversation is something that I do cover in my 6-week course. It is going to be specific to how everyone wants to get set up. If you're going to be private pay only, you can still give out of network super bills to people so that they can present them to their insurance companies for potential reimbursement. And you can also create lower cost sliding scale slots so that you can still get people in that, maybe are lower income or just can't afford your full rates. But talking about full rates, private pay versus insurance, all that stuff, I will cover in my course. So I just want to throw that out there too, because that's a big conversation to have.
Yeah, it's huge, and it directly impacts how much, when you're looking at your client load and your income potential, it directly impacts both of those. So, you want to help as many people as possible, but you got to take care of yourself too. So I know that Patrick, that is one thing he will talk about with you guys specifically. We've already talked kind of about the LLC versus PLLC. They're really the same thing for tax purposes. Some states just require you to go through the state board to set up an LLC. And at that point, they put the PLLC moniker in front of it. Sometimes that's a little more work on the front end. I know in North Carolina, if you're just, Patrick, I think you and I were talking about this not too long ago. If you set up an LLC to do say a coaching business or something, and then you have another LLC that is the PLLC, that LLC is going to have to pay $200 a year to the state. The PLLC in North Carolina, once you have it set up, you don't have to pay that annual report fee. So that's going to differ. I don't know every scenario in every state, but it's usually not too hard to find out. And you might know, or if you have a CPA already, you can probably ask them. You could also check in with probably the FAQs on your Secretary of State website. Anything about forming LLCs or PLLCs, you're either going to know from your state board website or their frequently asked questions or calling someone there, or you're going to get those questions answered from your state's Secretary of State. That's what the Secretary of State in all of these states is doing. A big part of it is governing, formation of businesses, et cetera. Independent contractors, we talked a little bit about this. I see most of the time in the counseling industry, it's not always, but a lot of times people, a lot of times people who are working for agencies are getting paid as independent contractors. Some of you are W-2s. Or if you're taking referrals, then that income can become, taxed to you as self-employment income as an independent contractor. There are a whole scenario of different ways that this can impact you. And the person who asked the question before, which is, I'm getting paid as an independent contractor. I know what the benefits are of being an S-corp. Can I do that? Should I ask them first? Do they need to be paying? Yes, they do need to be paying. In a perfect world, they need to be paying your new entity. If you're also then taking referrals, you've basically set up a private practice at that point. I have people right now who are working for agencies and taking referrals, and they've got a PLLC set up and they're combining those. They've gotten that okayed with the agency. They don't care, or they did some work to redo their credentialing so it would work that way. That's for people who are still working with agencies. If you're completely out on your own, then you get to make all these choices. But just remember what we went back to a little while ago, that order of operations can be fairly important and save you some headache down the road. Sometimes people are in business for years as a sole proprietor and then want to make this jump. You're just going to have to walk through that process and maybe take on some of the headaches that incurs. And it's okay, but it can just slow down payments, at least temporarily. The other option is, some of you out there are being paid from agencies as a W-2 and maybe allowed to moonlight. I've run into that scenario. It really is up to the agencies that you're working with. Getting paid on a W-2 versus a 1099 is a huge benefit to the employee, not necessarily to the employer. But if you're the employee, they're paying half of your self-employment tax, which is about 7.5%.
Josh, can you, sorry, I know there's feedback in that mic when I initially start talking to it. Can you go into the difference between W-2 and 1099 real quick in terms of what that means?
Sure. The W-2 is when someone considers you an employee, and the 1099 is when someone considers you an independent contractor. And you're probably going to run into this if you're in private practice too, and you start getting too many clients and you start sending referrals out, or you are like, hey, come, work underneath me, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what do I do with this? And the answer is there is no just right answer. The IRS gives you a matrix to determine whether or not this person is being treated as a W-2 employee or as a 1099 independent contractor. I have a lot of people that when they read those definitions. They're like, I'm definitely an employee of this agency. You know, why are they treating me as a 1099? And the short answer to that is because it's beneficial to the agency to treat you as a 1099. They're saving 7.65 odd % on every dollar that they spend on you. So, I mean, that's the easy answer. Whether they should be doing that or not is a different issue. If you want to sort of alert the IRS to that, there are ways to do that. But that's, you know, that comes with repercussions. Obviously, you know, if you are calling them out on something like that, you know, they probably don't have a huge incentive to keep you around. So be careful before you do anything like that. If you're in practice on your own and you're bringing in an employee versus an independent contractor, it really depends on how you're treating that person. And there is a matrix that the Internal Revenue Service gives you to say, hey, look at this, and then determine based on this whether or not these people are independent contractors or employees. And it really depends on how much control you exert over them. So if you've got a referral source and you're like, hey, I will refer you business and maybe we'll have a referral fee arrangement or something, but you don't have to take these people. It's up to you. But I'm going to make a referral. And if it works out, then, you know, then I'll pay you a referral fee. But that person is in practice for themselves. You don't exert any control over them other than like providing referrals or whatever. And then that person, you know, they can take it or leave it. You know, they're not getting any benefits. They're also, you know, the future of your relationship is not contingent on anything, perhaps maybe other than their ability and, you know, your own sort of quality control. But that person can be an independent contractor. You know, if you're telling a person that's like, hey, you can only see clients for me, you have to be here, you have to see a minimum of 5 clients a day, that starts to sound like an employee to me. And I personally think, my personal opinion is that a lot of these agencies are running counter to probably the intended spirit of the rule versus W-2s and 1099s. So if you run into that yourself, just work with someone to determine whether or not you should be paying them as an employee or an independent contractor. Does that kind of get all sides of that, Patrick, do you think?
It does, and it's a complicated situation. So just be careful when you're entering into relationships with people in terms of whether or not they're going to treat you as a 1099 or a W-2. Also be cautious if you're going to enter a group practice, leaving an agency feeling like a group practice is more secure than going out on your own, because there are going to be possible non-compete clauses included. There are going to be a lot of times where you can really get caught up in something where you go into a group because it feels safe and secure and consistent, but at the same time, you're almost creating a situation for yourself where you are making another agency in a different setting. So it's not really what you expect it to be. I just want everyone to be cautious about that. I've seen it happen too many times. Josh, I'm looking at time. Let's talk about deductions and let's talk about average tax rate. Those are two questions that come up a lot. Like, how much should I be setting aside for myself? That is a big question.
Yeah, I have, let me skip forward a couple of slides here. Here's the dreaded tax slide. If you're a sole proprietor, you are going to pay tax. If you're successful at this, you're going to pay tax. I throw this first number out there. $20,000 of net income could generate more than $5,000 of tax. I've seen that happen. It happens because you have two types of tax that you're paying as a sole proprietor, and you're paying your self-employment tax, which that's your Social Security and your Medicare. That's about 15.3% on the net tax or the net income from your business. The net income is the income that you have left over after your expenses. So you have gross income, which is your raw billing that you're getting paid. Then you take your expenses out of that. You're taxed on your net income, essentially. The 20,000 of net income, 15.3% of that is roughly $3,000 and change. That's just the self-employment tax. Then if you have income tax on top of that, that can easily, between federal and state, add another couple $1,000s to that. So I've had people that have made 20,000 of net income. Whoops, I keep doing that. they've made 20,000 of net income and their tax bill is like $5,000. And they're like, how on earth did this low amount of income have me owing this much? I've gotten a W-2 all the other years, and I've always had that, I've always gotten a refund or whatever. And the reason is because when you're a sole proprietor, you're the only person contributing towards your tax. If you're getting a W-2, if you're an employee for someone else, they're paying half of your self-employment tax. And the rest of that is getting withheld out of each paycheck. That's why when they send you a check, your gross paycheck is $1,000 and your net paycheck is $780. They're taking your side of the Social Security and Medicare out of that. And also you're going ahead and paying in some of your federal and state withholding. And so when you get to the end of the year, you've already got a credit with the IRS. When you're self-employed, whether you're a sole proprietor or an LLC or an S-corp or whatever you decide you're going to be, you're the only person who can pay that tax in for yourself. And so it gets into, you need to make estimated payments, or if you're an S-corp, you're going to need to maybe make estimated payments. And because in the S-corp, a lot of the tax savings comes because you're an employee of your own corporation, setting up your withholding. So all of that gets done right. But if you're not paying anything in and you had 20,000 of net income at the end of the year, even if you didn't owe any income tax, let's say that your situation is that you have enough other deductions on your tax return to cover all that, you're still going to pay about $3,000 of self-employment tax on that 20,000. And it's that self-employment tax that we can sort of get around with some of the S-corp. You can't get around all of it, that's illegal, but you can get around some of it because the IRS basically created a loophole in their own system on purpose called an S-corp. And that's what we help a lot of people when they get to a point where that can cover the administrative expenses. That's why we have people who sign up to become an S-corp and do the paperwork. And we can talk about that specifically if it ever comes up for you, or you can talk about that with your tax advisor now. It's an easy process, but there's some headaches that come along with it. You have to become an employee, you have to file to do payroll, and none of that is stuff that you're going to want to do yourself. You're going to want to have a payroll company, you're going to want to have a CPA who prepares your S-corp return. And to do all that, you have to either incorporate or you already have to have that LLC in place. So just to be clear, guys, I know that is really confusing language because I have been told that by Josh 100 times and my head just spins because I'm like, I really don't understand what the hell you're talking about. So needless to say, if you are a sole proprietor or a sole owned LLC or PLLC and not an S-corp, the average rate that people will say is 25 to 30% of your income needs to go to taxes. Is that correct, Josh? Yeah. I mean, if you're saving 25 to 30% of your income or making estimated payments, we talk about that right here. You can spread out your tax burden through making quarterly estimates. Some of you probably have done that before. Those estimated payments are essentially your withholding. Generally speaking, if you can get to about 25%, depending on your state, 25 to 30% of that net income amount. So that's just to hear that, that's net income, guys, not gross income. Okay. And we're going to talk about deductions next. So net income is your income after your deductions. Is that right, Josh? Yeah, that's correct. So a lot of people have this perception that like, oh, wow, I made $100,000 this year and I have to pay $30,000 to taxes. That's not accurate. You're going to be paying the percentage after your deductions. I have people that do set aside their what they think their taxes is going to be. So that they always know that they're going to have enough to pay, and they base it on their gross. And whatever works for you guys. What we don't want to have happen, and what routinely happens to people who just start business and they don't pay attention to any of this stuff, is they get to the end of the first year, they were moderately successful, maybe they had a short year, and it generates a ton of tax. And I've seen people get so discouraged from that they just pack it up and they go back to like whatever their system was, their employment situation was before. And that's no reason to do it. There are ways to work through that. But especially for those of you who are sort of in the startup phase, or perhaps this is in the side gig phase, again, no judgment on either of those. I'm saying that even if you generate a fairly small amount of net income, there's going to be some tax due. So just go into this knowing that there's no magic bullet to fire at this tax that can just make it go away. You know, and I've had people just be like, this is so unfair and I can't believe I'm paying this much tax, blah, blah, blah. But if you get to the end of the year and you're successful at this, there is going to be tax owed. And, you know, that's self-employment tax because you're having to pay both halves of it as a sole proprietor jumps up very quickly.
Right. And that's something I had to deal with too. I made a lot of money very quickly and I did not put enough money aside for taxes, or so I thought. But after all the deductions came out, I was actually okay. But I was really stressing out until Josh walked me through it and was like, no, you owe this amount, not 30% of like the money you made this year, but 30% of the money you made after your deductions come out. And I was like, okay, I can breathe again.
Yeah. And that gets to deductions. And I don't have, Patrick, I can stop sharing the rest of my slides. I don't have a slide in here specific to deductions, but we definitely want to talk about that. The only other thing I was going to say, I will send these slides out to you guys if you like. You can either email myself or my business partner. We're both pretty well versed in this. We've both given this presentation or similar presentations before, so I'll have our email address on there. And if you are, even if you don't work with us and you have a person that you're already working with, that's totally fine. Or if you want to find someone who's local, I totally get it. We work with people all over the country right now, especially this is becoming a much more virtual profession as well. So we're happy to work with you and work through your issues, even if it's in a state we're not as familiar with as North Carolina. We still have probably filed income tax returns in your state before. So we can figure out a lot of these state-specific issues. That's not a huge deal. We are allowed to practice in any state. We don't have to register, so that's not an issue for us.
And just as a bonus, man, this microphone really gives a lot of feedback when you start. Just as a bonus, if you do take my 6-week course about private practice building, Josh and Amy are going to be doing tax returns for the people that are in my course for a discounted rate or a rate that feels comfortable to them. So that is a bonus as well to take the course, because you will get some great tax advice and support from people who already work with private practice therapists all throughout the country.
Yeah, but yeah, whether you work with us or with someone else, I always tell people, it's like, don't take any advice that you get, whether from me or from, you know, an internet forum or whatever. Don't take any advice as just like, this is the way it has to be for everybody. One thing that working with a tax professional does is it gives them a chance to understand what your personal situation is and sort of tailor this stuff to that. There's no one right answer for everyone. So that's why it's, you know, when we do these presentations about what sort of business organization and where do we go, this is general stuff that we see coming up for you guys on the regular. But if you could have other situations, you could have other income, you can have a spouse who has situations that might change a lot of how we're doing this.
Right.
So, you know, there are a lot of reasons that we haven't covered here about why we might change something and do it a different way. And you just can't cover each situation, you know, in a presentation like this, which is why we say, hey, don't take this stuff at face value. Consult a tax professional about your specific situation and come up with a plan. And a lot of times, you know, I think that depending on what you're sort of doing with that person, you know, you'll have a very good return on your investment, especially if you get into the S-corps and stuff like that. Most of the time, the S-corps that I'm working with are saving anywhere from, you know, after administrative costs for payroll and an S-corp return, most of those people are saving anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000 a year. Some people are saving more than that as their practices grow. Some people that are smaller are not quite saving $3,000, but they're like, you know, once I got this set up and I'm saving an extra $1,500, $2,000 a year, it makes sense. After 10 years, that's an extra 20 grand in my pocket. You know, so it can work for people at all levels, but there are levels that it probably doesn't make sense to put all this stuff in place and be paying out extra administrative costs and, you know, just to pay your CPA or your payroll company instead of paying the IRS, you know? So we work with people to get them on the right track, and also on timing things. Where are you at in this situation? And that's pretty much the last slide I had. Patrick, you had some slides, I think, that were for deductions, didn't you?
Yeah, I can share that in a second. And let's talk about deductions. If you want to start, I'll get the slides up. And let's talk about home office deductions, if that's a thing that can even happen right now, given that a lot of people are going to be working out of their homes and their offices due to COVID.
Sure, absolutely. The home office deduction is a possibility. The home office deduction can be done multiple different ways, but by and large, if you rent your home, it's a great deal. If you own your home, it comes with some tax issues down the road, but if you're renting, it's a great deal. What you have to be able to prove to the IRS is that you have a space that is an office. And what an office, I remember the classic example from back when I was in school. They said a home office cannot have an oven in it. And what they mean by that is you cannot just say, hey, you know, I have this home office. I'm deducting, you know, too much of my square footage as my home office. And then when the IRS shows up and says, show me your home office, which they might do if you were getting audited, and they show up and then you say, oh, here's my home office and it's got an oven in it, that's not going to fly. So what we tell people is, like, if you have a home office, if you have a room or a space that you can set aside that needs to be an office with where your computer is, where you're seeing people, you know, you've got it set up. I know some people see clients physically in normal times, you know, in their homes. That's fine too. That actually makes it a lot easier to figure out what your office is. But if you've got that space, then what you do is you figure out your square footage of that space to your whole apartment or house or whatever. And at that point, if you have, you know, let's say your office is 200 square feet and your house is 100 square or 1,000 square feet, you know, 1/5 at that point of your expenses can be going towards your home office. It gets more complicated if you become an S-corp or do some things like that. But if you're a sole proprietor, this is very easy. If you're renting, it's almost a no-brainer. There are some, you can also do what's called a safe harbor home office, and we look at that ratio of your house to your office to your square footage of your total house. And a safe harbor simply says, hey, we're going to give you X amount up to $1,500 a year of a deduction that you don't have to provide documentation for. And the IRS made those rules. And but if you are renting, there's no downside to putting your apartment or your condo or whatever in service if you're seeing clients there or you're doing all your telehealth from there. There's no downside to that if you can prove it's a real home office. That's the big catch right there. But if you can prove that it's a real home office, then you don't have any, you know, sort of tax skeletons in the closet down the road that are possible if you own your home. We can talk about that if you want to. That's kind of getting into the weeds a little bit. But it can be a very good deduction. It can replace, in a lot of cases, a lot of what, or at least maybe not a lot, but a part of what you were spending if you were renting office space or sharing office space.
Let's talk about some typical deductions that you would have initially when starting a private practice.
Sure. So one of the deductions that I get all the time asked right away is, can I deduct my cell phone? Can I deduct, you know, like I've got to have a cell phone, you know, can I deduct that, or do I have to figure out how much of that's personal, blah, blah, blah. The IRS got tired of auditing this a few years ago. And they said, if you're using your phone at least 50% for business, which with these smartphones, you know, it's super easy to get to 50% because my email's on there, my calendar's on there, I take phone calls, you know, when I'm out and on location, sometimes places don't have internet access. So I'm using my hotspot, I'm doing all these things. You know, you can also get a business plan that's going directly through and being billed to your business. But yes, if you are using that at least 50% for your business, then the IRS says, go ahead and deduct 100%. go ahead and deduct 100% of that. And, you know, so right off the bat, that's usually for most people, $100 a month of a deduction right there. The other thing that for counselors specific, don't forget about your continuing ed. If you're doing continuing education and your travel and your meals for that, separate all that stuff out, because meals are deductible sort of at a different percentage. You can only deduct half of your meals for tax purposes. But generally speaking, travel to see clients or to go to conferences or education is deductible. Materials for that is deductible. The fee that you actually pay for those classes is deductible, even if it's online. The other big deductions for counselors are going to be, you know, computer website related, you know, that stuff can be deducted. If you have, you know, any office supplies, anything like that, obviously is a deduction. Any marketing that you do, any advertising, all of that is deductible. Education for yourself that is specifically related to your practice is deductible. I get a lot of times people asking me if coaching is deductible. I think it depends. It depends on what you're trying to do with that. But I would say, generally speaking, if it's to help you set up your business and go through, then, you know, most consulting arrangements in that are deductible. You know, a lot of times when you get into doing your own counseling, like I'm seeing a therapist as well, that typically is deducted as a medical deduction, which doesn't go through your business. So that's a little bit, I know that there's a huge like uproar about coaching versus counseling. And that is one of the things that, you know, counseling is typically considered a medical expense. Coaching could be, you know, seeing a business coach or, you know, consultant. That can definitely be a professional fee that is deductible.
If you took my,
it says internet is deductible. That usually comes in with one of the as one of your home office expenses if you're working from home. If you have to have internet at your office, if you sign up for a separate account and you have an off-site space, then yes, you can deduct that full amount. I saw someone say, can you deduct rented office and home office? Absolutely. The dedicated home office, it can be part-time. It still needs to be dedicated space that is used as a home office. But yes, you can have both, the same as if you had multiple locations for a business of actual rented space. Yes, you can deduct both. You probably would, you know, a lot of times when I see that, we will do the safe harbor for the home office, because then you don't have to prove how much of this, you're not looking through every single, you know, utility bill and all that stuff and coming up with these, coming up with the, you know, ratio, et cetera.
and I just want to say that if you did take my coaching course, I'm just going to plug it again, that would be deductible because we are working solely on building your private practice and your business. So I just want y'all to know, trainings like Josh said, there are some cool trainings that are happening outside of the country, outside of your state. Those are all deductions that you can make once we're out of a COVID era and you feel comfortable to travel. Once again, does the home office have to be a whole separate room, or can I use the space in my bedroom that I use for telehealth?
Oh, sorry, I'm muted. There we go. Can you hear me now? Yep. It depends. You know, the space, it's kind of weird. Like, I've seen the IRS challenge some of these like bedrooms, but you know, that might be the only space you have. So, you know, in that case, we look to see if it will be a space that that applies by the IRS rules. Usually that is a case-by-case basis.
Do we have to first have a business open to deduct?
Oh, I think this person's asking, like, if you're starting a business and you're already having expenses, you know, can you deduct those once you go into business? It depends. There can be, if, you know, it depends on what your time frame is there. Generally speaking, you know, I wouldn't say that if you started kicking around the idea of opening a business in 2015 that you should probably be deducting those expenses now. But there can be startup expenses that are deducted. Certainly, if all of that stuff happens in the same year, then it's usually easier to deduct it at that point. If this goes past calendar years and you don't have any income, that can run into some issues, but there are ways to make elections to deduct startup costs, even if you don't necessarily have any income. But generally speaking, those startup costs, we would probably like amortize those over the life of over 5 years or so if you have a bunch of startup costs and you don't have any income, because, typically this stuff has to be in service, not just paid for to be a deductible item. So that's something, if you're going to have a lot of startup expenses, work with your tax person to see how you're going to treat those. And a lot of times it's not really that big an issue. You guys typically don't have a ton of expenses to start up.
Do you see that, Josh?
Yeah, can I deduct the furniture I bought for an office I never ended up using because of COVID, now using telehealth from home instead? It depends on if you bought that stuff with the purpose of putting it in your, like a physical office, and then all of a sudden it's in your bedroom, no, you can't deduct it. If it's part of your home office, I would argue that yes, probably you could. PLLC filing fees, absolutely, those are deductible.
Same for the fees that you pay for licensure renewal. You can deduct those as well.
Yeah, and if you have any annual reports, if you have any annual report fees or stuff that are associated with your LLC, those are considered by default an expense of the business. Yeah, any licensing, any, professional dues, Patrick, I see them come to our office here. What's the Psychology Today, dues and subscriptions, stuff like that,
Yep.
Anything like that you are buying for your practice, I have one too, which is, what's it called? Journal of Accountancy. That stuff comes through like our national board. Your liability insurance is absolutely a deduction. That's another specific one to counselors or professionals. Your liability insurance, if you have an office and you're required to have liability protection on that space, that's also deductible. Obviously,
your supervision fees. Yeah,
anything that you're having to pay. And Patrick, you can probably talk about that a little bit.
Yep.
These supervision fees, if you're doing this before your 2 years, or did you tell me it was 4,000 hours?
Yeah. And it's state specific, so it just kind of depends.
But if anything that you're paying for that kind of stuff, absolutely is deductible. I saw somebody said if I pay the LLC fees this year, but I don't get the business started until next year, will that be okay? It is. I mean, the LLC fees are typically not super expensive, but if you paid those, and I'm assuming you're saying you're going into business starting in 2021, yeah, you can deduct those. You can either set those up as a startup expense, or if you're seeing some clients this year, deduct that against your income from this year.
Someone says, does it matter the size of your practice to get any, if these, like only seeing 1 to 2 clients a week and still not having any issues with the IRS? I don't really understand the question, Christopher.
I think I do. What they're saying is like, if I'm only seeing 1 or 2 clients a week, can I still get these deductions against that income?
Okay.
The short answer is yes. One thing that you have to be careful about, and I don't really see how they would do it with counseling, but as sole proprietors, you guys have to understand from the IRS, everybody's a sole proprietor. Like the number of businesses out there in this country that are sole proprietors, over like 95% of them are sole proprietors. 95% of all business entities, are sole proprietors. And a lot of those are fraudulent. So what happens is, the IRS looks at people that are constantly running losses through their tax returns as a quote unquote business. And they have some things in place to guard against that, and they're called hobby loss rules. So the IRS doesn't want to see you engaging in being a sole proprietor for too many years, and and taking losses each of those years. So, you know, I think even if you're only seeing 1 to 2 clients a week, you know, and you're still going to be able to deduct a lot of things. I think when you get to that range of things, probably things that get a little harder to deduct are going to be saying that I have a specific, you know, place in my house that I can call a home office. You know, you're probably, if you're only seeing 1 or 2 people a year, say, would it be okay to say, hey, I have a home office for those? So, you know, it really depends on your situation if you're too small for any of those. But if you're in business on the reg, you know, you can certainly deduct your insurance and all that stuff against, you know, how many, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're seeing 1 client a week or 100 a week. You know, but, you know, you want to make sure that you're not, you know, probably deducting too many things that could be viewed as not having a business purpose at that point. If you're only seeing 1 or 2 clients a week and you're deducting, you know, these extravagant trips for CE or something like that, that probably is going to be frowned upon. So it really just depends. And one thing I'll mention too, like Patrick mentioned earlier, if you're traveling overseas for continuing education, there is a possibility of deductions, but when you leave the country, it gets a little trickier to deduct stuff. So be careful on that.
Someone asked if an accountant or an attorney fee is deducted.
Absolutely. As long as it is for your business. So if we're working with sole proprietors and we do their personal tax return, let's say we bill somebody $400 for that. And what we usually do is allocate part of our fee toward their sole proprietor. Not all of your personal tax return is deductible, but any stuff that's done specifically for the business is deductible. Another thing too is, and this changed in 2018, it used to be that meals and entertainment were 50% deductible. Entertainment is 0% deductible now. So if you're taking, you know, your clients or colleagues or something to the Super Bowl, no longer deductible. If you're taking them to play golf, non-deductible. Fly fishing trips, not deductible. You know, concerts, not deductible. But if you're going to have a meal with someone, 50% deduction.
You see that question from Katie. Is there any need to track where the income comes from, individual sessions, groups, workshops, or just label it as income?
For tax purposes, there's not really, it doesn't matter. That's a great question. It doesn't really matter for tax purposes, except when we were talking earlier, like if this stuff is coming from different states, that can be an issue. So you would need to track it there. The thing that I would argue that do you want to see where your income is coming from? You know, do you want to see how much income you're generating from individual sessions, or versus, you know, what was your, let's see, like workshops or group sessions? Do you want to see, you know, where your income is coming from? And if you do, then yeah, track it. You know, I track each individual part of my income because I like to see where it comes from. And what you'll find is that, you know, when you look at where your money's coming from, where your income is coming from, and you have it grouped, then you can say, wow, I've done this same thing. So a lot of times you'll look at that and you can be like, wow, I'm spending, you know, 30 or 40% of my time and a lot of my anxiety on 10% of my income. Why am I doing that? And if you don't keep up with that, then a lot of times you can't see it on paper. So that, I mean, I guess I'm saying that to say for tax purposes, you may or may not need to. For management purposes or for your personal purposes, you might get some info that you wouldn't normally get. Therapy dogs, usually not. I don't know specifically if that's something that is, you know, that you have specifically for your practice. Generally speaking, things like that with animals are related to their specific purpose. And I think a lot of times they would argue that that there is, you know, if you have that dog for, your office, but then it's living at home, and it gets into some tricky areas. Generally speaking, they frown on deductions for animals like that, and anything for if you're blind and need a seeing eye dog or something like that, a lot of times that ends up being a medical deduction, and it's not business related at that point. And if you're talking about just bringing your dog to the office and deducting and calling it a therapy dog, I think that the IRS is going to generally frown on that. Yes, that is how the utilities and stuff for home office go. When you figure out your square footage, that gets applied to all of your utilities. If you're using that method, if you're using the simple method, then it's just your percentage of space that matters.
Okay. A lot of good questions, and I hope this was really helpful. Josh, thank you so much for your time, man. Like, very valuable stuff, and you answered a ton of questions and information. Any last minute questions before we go? I'm gonna share what is in store for tomorrow.
Let me say one thing real quick. All I was going to say is, if you guys do have other questions about, that you think of later, or that you're like, hey, I forgot to ask this, or, whatever, we're going to make our email addresses available to you. The only thing I will say is we have a deadline in a week. So if I don't immediately get back to you, we will get back to you. It just might take a week or so. I'm going to be pretty slammed this next week. So we're going to try to push, a lot of these types of questions out, at least until we're past that deadline. And then you'll be getting my better side of my brain anyway. We will be absolutely happy to, follow up on some questions. If you guys want to schedule any time with either Amy or I to go over this stuff and see how that relates going forward. We always give a free consultation to people as an initial meeting anyway. And then, going forward, we can see where that relates to, whether you want to become a client of ours, or if it's just good advice and then you find your own person, that's all totally fine. But we're happy to follow up with you guys just in the next week or so. If I'm not super responsive, it's because I've got a deadline coming up. Just wanted to let you know.
Josh, one question that comes up, and maybe I know you can't answer this in a short version because it's state specific and it's unique and individualized, but people are asking suggested rates for accountants that are credible.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. I'll try to be short about that, but it will. It really depends, number one, on what the CPA is doing for you. If you've got someone who's doing your bookkeeping and your tax return and all that stuff, you're obviously going to be paying more for that than someone who, we just have, an hour meeting every year. We do a tax return, we figure out where things are going, and then we, respond to that. I don't personally like to bill out like attorneys do, which is usually by the hour. I like to work on fees that allow people to ask questions. For most of our clients, if they're sole proprietors, they're usually paying between $400 and $500 a year. That's not the cheapest out there, but we also don't send people bills for asking us questions, et cetera. If you're an S-corp, that has extra stuff associated with it, and an extra tax return. That usually for our fee for the S-corp return and the setup and all of that, and helping with those questions and getting payroll set up, blah blah blah, that usually ends up being about $800 a year. So for people that we're doing everything for them, we have a lot of people that are, around $1,000 to $1,200 for a year. So that ends up being $100 a month. That's for mostly tax work, and, like some light bookkeeping and help setting up a spreadsheet. And, again, like consultations and questions as they come up. And then if we have people that are billing, they're asking us to do more. It really just depends on what they ask. Our billing rate for tax work, if we're doing stuff hourly, we usually are billing $160 an hour. If we're doing bookkeeping work, that's usually $80 an hour. That's probably middle of the road for CPAs. I would say if you've got a larger firm, you'll run into some huge $300-400 an hour rates. And if you're doing maybe people that aren't CPAs and are just going to do your tax work, you'll probably find lower rates than that. What I would say is it really depends on what they're doing for you. We have people also that most of the time people from us get 1 or 2 bills a year, and that that 1 or 2 bills a year is typically just for their business tax return and their the business tax return and their personal tax return. We do have special projects that come up from time to time with clients, and for that stuff, we'll see, how long do we think this is going to take, and we usually give people a billable range. I don't like working on open-ended hourly arrangements. And, it's kind of one of those things that you're going to find a lot of different CPAs who do it differently. A lot of CPAs are moving to these packages where they're like, hey, we want you to have, we're going to charge you X amount a month, and, and then this is what you get. And a lot of stuff in that is maybe not necessary for you guys because, again, your business and your bookkeeping are fairly simple. So it's, it's not a difficult, you don't run into typically a lot of difficult accounting issues. So it should be pretty simple. Those fees for us are pretty close to our minimum fees. And so I think if you're probably paying, again, it depends. Patrick and I were talking about this earlier. If you're in the Northeast or San Francisco or DC or something, you're probably going to pay more than that. And there are places out there that would probably look at my rates and be like, well, you can get this done cheaper, in Nebraska. I don't know. I'm not picking on Nebraska, but, or where I grew up in Virginia, it's super rural. There are probably people there who would do it for cheaper as well. It's one of the things that we're running into as we become more virtual is that there's this evening out of rates across the country. Because so many more people can do this from other places for cheaper, and you're not having to, if you're in Manhattan, you're not having to necessarily hire a Manhattan CPA firm and pay all their overhead, et cetera. So
good point. And what Josh is saying is really important. I see a lot of questions coming in about, I want to use someone who works with therapists. I think that's a great idea. And to be fair, it's kind of like interviewing a therapist. Like, you want your accountant to be a good fit for you. You want your accountant to feel like you feel comfortable with them discussing your money and your finances and feeling like they're not going to take advantage of you. So I highly recommend, like, Josh is very generous with his time, and maybe not all accountants are going to say, like, I'm going to answer all of your questions and give these free consultations, but take advantage of some free consultations to ask some questions specifically about your business structure, about your situation, whether or not you have a partner who's also employed or whatever that may look like, so that you get a good idea of what you should be paying come tax time. And if you decide, I want to work with this person, if it's Josh, Amy, or whoever, just making that commitment, you're not going to pay that up front. You're going to pay it when it comes to tax time most of the time. And, so I really want to say that. Some accountants are going to bill you by the hour, like Josh said, almost like a lawyer would. And, I steer clear from people like that because I think that you get more personalized care elsewhere. So I'm going to show you real quick what tomorrow is going to be like. I saw a couple of comments about being here tomorrow. In order to raffle off the prize for Josh's free tax return or my free coaching package, that is a part of this, like trying to attend both sessions, tomorrow is going to be strictly about private practice building. So what we're going to be doing is we are going to be talking about the following. Oh, niche. I know a lot of people hate that word. Branding, content creation, marketing, coaching. I asked one of my coachees who their ideal client was, and they told me athletes 14 to 25 dealing with eating disorders, depression, and anxiety. You can see the response afterwards. I enjoy working with athletes and performers with traits and tendencies of perfectionism that manifest by the way of paralyzing fear on the court and field, obsession with food and exercise, sadness and guilt for taking time off or resting, the inability to receive feedback without feeling of failure or rejection, feeling like an outsider in the family system, experiencing confusion, seeking clarity around the identity of the worth outside of competition. In my coaching course, that's what we're doing. We're creating content for your ideal clientele so that you get more clients calling you who want to work with you, but not only who want to work with you, that you want to work with, that you get really excited about working with, and more private pay clients as well. We're going to talk about marketing and networking, not feeling like a used car salesman, impostor syndrome. How do we move through that? What is it? How does it show up? Rate setting, charging what you're worth, confidence about it. What are we selling? What are we offering? And then obviously the end. So that will be tomorrow. I hope everyone can make it. I think it's going to be really exciting to talk about this stuff. I am going to be on my own tomorrow, so answering questions is going to be a little more challenging, but I'm going to do my best to do both. So like I said, if anyone has questions about my upcoming courses, please email me. I'll put my email in the chat again. And we're going over a lot of stuff in that. We're going over all of the stuff I just mentioned. We're going over writing content for your ideal client. We get 2 individual coaching sessions, 6 group coaching sessions, a private Facebook group where you can ask questions and get support for life, discounts to upcoming webinars and trainings, and Voxer support daily, like a walkie-talkie almost, to bounce ideas off of each other. My goal is to get you out of your agencies into your private practices, navigating all the nitty-gritty, complex details that feel overwhelming, and doing so in a way that feels confident so that you can take more vacation time, you can charge what you're worth, and you can do the things that you want to do out of life, living a life that's worth living instead of the other way around. So feel free to ask questions. Check out my website so you can get a feel for who I am and my story. I'm really happy to talk about this stuff. And then Josh just put his email in the chat. I'm going to highlight that again. So Josh Sullivan and Amy Sullivan's emails, those are right there. I would copy those, get their contact information and, work with an accountant who works with therapists. Our field is specific. You want people who understand empathetic human beings that sometimes get a bit overwhelmed or insecure or anxious about money stuff and feel fearful. Josh has saved my ass emotionally with this stuff many times.
I had one question for you, Patrick. I saw somebody up there who said, I can't find it right now, but it said, "Hey, how are you? I would love to have these slides. How are you guys going to get those to us?"
Yep, I saw that. So what I'm going to do is I have a newsletter that goes out every Tuesday. You can actually find my newsletter and a free guide to starting your private practice that includes links to get your EIN, your CAQH, your MPI, all your HIPAA compliant software on my website. So if you sign up for my newsletter on my website, you're going to be getting an email coming out with the slides, the videos from both days, and more importantly, the winners of the raffles. So that's the way to do it. If you want to get that information, please feel free to sign up. I'm not going to bombard you or spam you with nonsense. It's just going to be helpful stuff. So Cassandra asked how to enter the raffle. So you want to like my pages, my Facebook page, Casale Coaching and Consulting, my Instagram, Casale Coaching, and Josh's Facebook page, which is what, Josh?
It's Sullivan Sullivan, PLLC.
So I hope this was helpful. Tomorrow I hope will also be helpful in a different way. We're going to talk much more about the process of going through private practice and really making sure that you do so successfully and with support. I'm just going to do more shameless self-promotion. Brighter Vision has an awesome event going on called Fall into Cash 2020. It's an entire month where they are promoting therapists, coaches, entrepreneurs, business owners, etc. There's webinars, podcasts, video presentations, lots and lots of raffles. You can win entrance to registration for lots of upcoming trainings and conferences. You can win coaching packages from people. My friend Ernesto, who was on the panel before, is giving away a GoPro 8 if you attend his webinar, all free. All you need to do is sign up at the link. And I will provide that link right now because I think it's really cool. And the more free shit, the better. Like, I think that is it's a really unique thing. So let me send that link real quick. Anyone have questions, feel free to post them in right now while I'm looking for that link. Sorry, the internet is a bit spotty, so opening multiple things at once is causing a little complication. But I've got it. And here it is. And yeah, check that out because you can win so much stuff. Like, hell, I just want to win the GoPro 8, to be honest with you. And then there's training registration invites. There's all sorts of cool stuff going on. So Critter Vision, a company that develops websites for therapists and only therapists, really cool stuff. All into Cash 2020 is what it's called. Everyone have a great Tuesday, and I will plan on seeing most of you tomorrow, and I'll be sending this stuff out by the end of the week, and I'll send out the raffle winners as well. So everyone take care. Have a good day. Josh, anything to add?
Thanks, guys, so much for having me. Hope this was very helpful.
Oh, thank you, guys. Take care.